Well, a few years ago, I got a call, and I think it was from Brian Connolly, who was coming down to the Cape to meet Jan Salick, and he was hoping he could catch up with me and I could meet her, but she was looking for some information about plants flowering here. And I was out in the field at Crane Wildlife Management Area, helping to monitor a study of what's now called Persicaria. What's the awful one? I'm sorry.
Longus pike?
No, it's
Longicida?
It's Polygonum.
Talking about
No,
Mile-a-minute?
Persicaria. Yeah, the mile-a-minute vine.
Oh.
Yeah, okay.
Mile-a-minute vine.
There we go.
This is going to be posted.
You're fine.
There was a study going on out there, and what we found was the area where the study was had all been treated by herbicide. So there wasn't any sign of the plants or the other vegetation that might be competing with those plants. Anyway, I got the call from Brian and I wasn't able to go to meet Jan. But Chris Poloni, who loves to go to Coffee Obsession for coffee, found them and he recognized Brian. So we had a conversation and then he told me about Jan, and that was how I met her. And we've been working together ever since. Jan's pretty good at getting Dawn and Pam and others to go out in the field and see what's flowering every few days.
Once a week.
And I'm not so much. And Jan's going to introduce herself, really. But I really enjoy working with Jan. She's become a close friend.
Usually you meet in bars, but we met in a coffee bar.
No, I can't thank Brian enough. This relationship that has developed over the last, we've been working together 5 years now. This is the 5th year that we've been working together, and it is just one of the highlights of my career. And I have worked all over the world in the most exotic places that you can think of, in Indonesia, in the Himalayas, in the Amazon, in South Africa, and here I end up in Cape Cod and just find more fulfillment and more interesting questions, or as many as I find in the rest of the world. So it's just been a tremendous experience for me. Tonight I feel as though I am profiting off of the misfortune of others. My dear friend Carmen Ulloa was supposed to be speaking to you tonight, and she was really looking forward to coming. I have been talking up the Cape and the coast and the islands for the last 5 years for my colleagues at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And finally I was going to get one of them to come out and see what this was all about. And unfortunately she couldn't make it, and so then as Don Schall said, I'm not your first choice, but I'm worth your time. So I really do appreciate it. Don gives backhand compliments better than anybody I know. But so I'm an ethnobotanist, which I'm sure you're not, tremendously used to hearing from. But I define ethnobotany in a much broader sense than most people think of ethnobotany. I do study plant uses, I do study medicinals, I do study foods and so on. But I usually try to keep a larger context, and that's why I've entitled this Climate and Environmental Changes to Indigenous Lands and Plants on the Cape Coast and Islands. because I see climate change as much ethnobotany as anything else. I mean, it's the people who are increasing the carbon dioxide, which is affecting the plants, and in turn, the change in the vegetation is affecting people. And so this interaction between plants and people is how I view ethnobotany. So you may not, I'm going to talk in a broader sense than you might be aware of. So the area that I chose is, you people know better than I do, and I am in 5 years just beginning to learn about the Cape, the coast, and the island. But I am finding it a very rich and rewarding place to study. You people are extremely affected by climate change. This is one of the studies on climate change that show sea level rise and warming, and you can see this little purple area right off the northeast, and that's some of the highest. You know, I never knew that sea level was different. You know, how do you have mounds in the sea? You know, it's all supposed to be flat out there. But in fact, because of the currents and so on, you do. And there's some of the highest sea level rise in this area. Temperatures are rising every year. It gets warmer and warmer around here, and we had a summer that we just survived barely that proves that point. We have some incredible erosion. This was Hermione in 2016, but we see this continually, the erosion. We've had some periods of drought, and it's predicted now that we're going into yet another El Nino cycle, which would mean that we may expect, we had drought this summer. You know, it was incredibly humid. How it can be so humid and be dry at the same time, I have never experienced this anywhere. But around here, it's true. So we may get another period of drought next year. The effects of climate change we see all over the place. Here's a house falling into the ocean, of course. This is Ile Nauset, that is not there. They call this, I guess, the Atlantis of the Cape, where it has absolutely sunk into the ocean. It used to have an Indian village on it, a prosperous Indian village on it, and it's no longer there. And in the bottom right-hand corner, I'm paddling myself through the tidal marshes, and we see all over the Cape and the coast and the islands, we see trees dying, invasive species coming in, and so on. So you all are very familiar with the effects of climate change in the area. I have 3 ongoing studies that I've been doing for the last 5 years. One is on place names, and this was inspired, I don't know if you people have heard of Jessie Littledoe Baird. She is this woman, a Wampanoag woman, who in a dream, just one of these Native American stories that's just, in a dream, these people were talking at her in some language, and she knew she was listening really hard and trying to understand what they were telling her, and she couldn't understand. And she'd have it night after night after night, and she could barely, you know, she'd wake up in the morning exhausted. She finally realized it was her ancestors speaking to her in Wampanoag, and Wampanoag had been lost by that time, and they were begging her to bring back the language. And so she went up to MIT and studied with a linguist up there, and has used, they've got thousands of documents. You know, Wampanoag was one of the first languages that they Native American languages that they translated the Bible into. So, I mean, the vocabulary is a little weird in the Bible, but I mean, it's a basis. And lots of documents on deeds and descriptions, and a lot of the pilgrims learned to speak Wampanoag because their survival depended on it. It was the Wampanoag that taught them how to farm in this area. It taught them what they could eat, taught them how, you know, what the environment was like. And so She has resurrected Wampanoag. There are now 7 fluent speakers. She was the first fluent speaker. There are now 7 fluent speakers in Wampanoag, and they have an intensive primary school in Wampanoag now. So I just can't say enough about Jessie. Jessie has a database of 4,000 Wampanoag place names around the Cape Coast and the islands. She and I sat down when I first started, and we just talked and talked and talked, and it was the most inspiring meeting that I've ever had. And at the end of the meeting, she said, "But I don't have time to do this." And I'm like, "What?" You know, I was just like ready to go out. And so on my own, without Jessie, I have gone forth, and I have somewhat over 200 place names that I can get good translations for, and that's the critical part. So I'll tell you about that study. The second study is what I've been doing with Pam and Don and so on this phenology, where we go out only once a week, Pam, not every other day. And we're looking at the change in flowering patterns over 150 years, and I'll tell you about that program. And the third one is a little more traditional ethnobotany, but it too is not probably what you're thinking of. And I'm working with the Narragansett on what they call their food sovereignty initiative, and so I'll tell you about that too. So first, let's start out with the place names. These are the places that I have visited. This is just a wonderful study, an excuse to know a new environment. I've gone all over the Cape, I've gone all over Martha's Vineyard, and I've gone all over Nantucket, just walking over people's land that I shouldn't be on, and saying, "Excuse me, I'm doing a study, you know, I'm a scientist from the Missouri Botanical Garden, and could I walk on your land?" And most people say yes. So I really learned a tremendous amount just looking for these places. We have a few, this summer we've been concentrating on the Elizabeth Islands, and we've got most of that done. I have one major site that I would still like to go to, and I tried to talk Chris into it today while we were out saying, "Could we take your sailboat?" This is another friend who I convinced to go out to Cuttyhunk on his sailboat, you know, so I kind of rope as many people into this as I can. The sites that are red and kind of stand out are those that are, we can see the effects of climate change on them. And you can see that the islands and the east coast of the Cape are those areas that have been most affected by climate change. But there are, you know, throughout the Cape we can see it as well. If you look at the names of these places in Wampanoag, you find that it's just really obvious that they had a very diverse and intricate natural resource management strategy, you know, if you will, including water resources, agriculture, forestry, hunting, gathering, and so on. It's just very, very complex, and they name places based on what they use them for. When the Pilgrims came in, the Westerners came in, they started naming places after people or kind of historical events and things. But the Wampanoag, by and large, did not do that. They named it after the resources that were available at that place. Then we have land use maps from the 1850s. You all have heard Professor Foster speak on this, I'm sure. He studied the vineyard in particular, but that same map that he's using actually included Buzzards Bay and the Cape and Nantucket. And so we really, from the 1850s, we have a very good idea of how people were using the land, and it was completely different. You know, they were grazing sheep, they were doing some forestry, and a little bit of crop agriculture, but not so much more. So it went from this very complex, seasonal, changing use of the environment to one that was relatively simplistic. And then if you go today, I could go place by place and tell you what was happening in different places, but I won't take that much time. And just the bottom line is tourism and luxury lifestyles is what characterize so much of the Cape, the coast, and the islands. A site that was called, the place where you fish for eel has turned into a marina, a boatyard. And there's not an eel in sight. So, there's been tremendous change over time. Nashan is maybe in Elizabeth Islands, is a property of the extended Forbes family, and it might be the exception that almost proves the rule, is on that island they have forbidden use of gasoline engines. They have some electric cars and so on. And they have worked really hard to maintain the environment there, but only through that tremendous. It's once you get to a level of wealth like that, then you can transcend the luxury, And although that house is pretty luxurious, so I don't know how much of an exception it is. That yacht's pretty luxurious, But on the other hand, those kids are having good old-time fun, so that's pretty nice. Okay, the second study is on the phenology that I told you about, and 150 years. How do I get 150 years? There was a lovely gentleman, Eliphalet Williams Harvey, who published first in 1860, and then once in between, and then finally in 1911. And he published on what he called the procession of flowers along the shores of Buzzards Bay. And he told when things flowered 150 years ago. So when I first came here, I went up to our library. The Missouri Botanical Gardens has one of the great botanical libraries in the world. Went up to our library and I looked for Cape Cod, and this little publications showed up on the shelves. And I was like, oh my God, this is a gold mine of information. So I designed the study to go back and try to redo it. Well, let me tell you what, he spent his whole life going out every free moment that he had on horseback and writing down when he saw things flowering. And in 5 years is a long time in terms of a scientific study, but 5 years when somebody has spent 70 years, looking at phenology is a very short period of time. And I couldn't have even dreamt of doing this study without Pam Poloni. There's Mario de Gregorio. In the beginning, he was a tremendous inspiration for me, and then the other picture is of Don Schall, and characteristically, Don is just kind of squatting down there at Sandy Neck, with this bag full of books that he carries around with him everywhere, keying out plants like crazy. And so I go out with these people as frequently as they can tolerate me, which at times I wear thin on them, I know. So Harvey did over 50 years of data. He got 1,281 species. He did it in 2-week time periods. He recognized there was variability, and so he tried to characterize it within 2 weeks. And he was referencing Asa Gray. He was a friend of Asa Gray's, and referenced Asa Gray. I am working over only a 5-year period. At this point, we have a little bit over 700 species, and we have somewhat over 2,900 observations. The data, we take the dates observed rather than these 2-week periods, and we measure the variability rather than, you know, just trying to bracket it. And we're referencing USDA, Tropicos, and Haynes, if we have to. In our, and you know, and then we can translate what Hervey had into our modern taxonomy. The questions we asked are: when are things flowering? How different is flowering time now? Do years differ? Does time of year influences the differences? How long is flowering, and does it differ now? Which I'm not going to get into much tonight. Does flowering of native and introduced species differ, and what are the implications for climate change? Again, getting back to the climate change. The black bell curve here represents our contemporary observations, and the white, the somewhat opaque bell curve represents Hervey's representations. And you can see today that things are flowering earlier and flowering later than they did during Hervey's time. There is a yearly variation. This shows 4 years of our data. This is our 5th year, so I don't have that analyzed yet. But and it does change from year to year. They're significantly different year to year. But none of them are different, but they're all different from Hervey. They all show the same trend of flowering earlier and flowering later. So here's the actual data. And this, these are the number of observations and the difference between our contemporary data and Hervey's data. And these are the number of observations. The red line is where we have identical observations. And on this side is where things are flowering earlier, and on that side where things are flowering later. And what's interesting is most of the literature on phenology show that with climate change we're getting earlier flowering. But what we're finding is an even greater trend is that we're getting later flowering. I mean, this isn't tremendously surprising, but it's not in the literature. So to that extent, it's interesting. Again, these are the contemporary observations, and this is the mean difference between us. And if it's 0, if that red line means that we've got the same observations, Hervey and now. And this is Julian days down here, so the earlier in the year. Earlier in the year, you tend to get that earlier flowering, and later in the year, you tend to get the later flowering. So we know when, you know, this difference is. And then you get just totally wonky flowering. Yes?
I can see why it would come earlier if there was a rise in temperature, but I don't understand why is there later.
Because it's so warm out here today. You haven't, yeah, I mean, things just keep flowering. And here's a very exaggerated, this is New Year's Day in 2017, and you've got yarrow blooming. You know, we just...
That early?
Is that early or late? Is that what you're asking?
It seems like that would be early, they're just flowering in...
Well, it's, when it gets to that point, you can't distinguish between early and late. It's just wonky. So and that was the point I was going to make, is that I took these wonky things and I threw them out. I said, well, okay, let's just, you know, accept that there's bizarre things going on, but let's look at the trends. And so if we throw out the stuff in red, what do we get? And we get almost a pretty close to straight line. Here again, when the observations are the same, and then this red line I just artificially drew through summer solstice. And things before summer solstice tend to be flowering earlier, things after summer solstice tend to be flowering later. And I think it's just, you know, we're staying warmer much, much longer than we used to, and things just keep flowering longer than they ever did. Now, exactly why this is, if you were asking me that, I don't have the answer to that. What's that? Well, that's, yeah, I mean, no, it's climate change. I mean, it's not only warmer ocean, it's just that climate is changing, but how plants know to keep flowering, that's a physiological question. And then if you divide the data on the summer solstice, you get a tremendously significant difference with earlier flowering early in the year and later flowering later in the year. Another question that comes up in the literature is comparing the native and introduced species. Now, Hervey had introduced species. It wasn't as though introduced species only come now. But there wasn't a significant, in his time, there wasn't a significant difference between introduced and native species. But now, on the far side, you can see that there is a significant difference. And the introduced species tend to flower earlier. And I think that's because they have a little open window. There's not a lot of competition early. You know, we've got those early warm springs, and a lot of the native species aren't kicking into gear fast. And so the introduced species have the ability to take advantage of that window. Okay, so we see that today we have expanded flowering seasons. There's yearly variation is significant, but it doesn't change the difference in 150 years. Today is flowering is both earlier and later, and with the caveat that the same flowering time is still the most common. So most species still flower when they did 150 years ago, but there is significant differences nonetheless. And just to let you know, I didn't show you the data on this, but the duration of flowering tends to grow is much greater now than it used to be. So how long things are flowering is increasing. And what that means is another big question that would take a lot of study to answer. Introduced species tend to flower earlier now than our native species. And I took these data to my colleague, my Narragansett colleagues, and presented this to them and said, so what do you make of this? You know, what do you think's going on? And they started talking about the disassociation of indicator species, the fact that the shad bush no longer reliably flowers at the time that the shad are running, which used to be the indicator species. They talk about yield reductions of useful species. They think that blueberries are not producing as much as they used to, or they're producing in different patterns than they used to. They complain about not knowing when to go out and harvest things because they can't predict when the things are going to ripen. And they complain that their indigenous knowledge is displaced by these climate factors, modern climate factors. Their stories and beliefs are becoming irrelevant. And they talk about, they talk drastically about things like cultural annihilation with climate change. And I'm like, whoa, this is, they're really, and I'll tell you a little more about the Narragansett and climate change in a minute. So then my third project, as I said, that's kind of an introduction into my work with the Narragansett. I would have loved to have worked with the Wampanoag, but the Wampanoag, I had a hard time convincing them that I was useful. Whereas the Narragansett just welcomed me in, and we have developed a great rapport, a great program together. So this is, as I said, this man is my colleague, Cassius Spears. He's the coordinator of the Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative, which he founded. And it was founded because, and this is one of the most heartwarming stories that I know. This piece of land encircled in that red ellipse, there is, the Narragansett had allowed a family in 1670, had given this piece of land to a family to farm. And 3 years ago, I met the man, 5 years ago when I started, I met the man who was farming that, the last living relative of this family. And when he died, he gave the farm back to the Narragansett because they had no more farmers in the family. I was just like, oh, would that happen more often? But it's an amazing farm because it encompasses so much. There's around the outside, there's Atlantic white cedar swamp, which the Narragansett value very highly, both for the cedar itself, which they make canoes out of, and so on, but also as a habitat for wildlife. And they really, Pam helped organize a symposium on Atlantic white cedar 3 years ago, something like that. And I took a chance and brought a couple of Narragansett to that conference and asked them to give a presentation. And the USDA people and so on that were there said they had never heard a presentation that was more inspiring, because these people are just so, passionate about how important this and many other habitats. Then, then inside the Atlantic white cedar swamp, then there's upland forest, and inside that is kind of a scrub land, and then the farmland itself, you can see, is just this small, relatively small area in the very center.
Excuse me, what town is that in or near?
Westerly,
Westerly.
it's near Narragansett. It's close to their territories, but near the Connecticut border with Rhode Island, in the southern part of the state. Okay, so this is the Atlantic white cedar swamp, and then the USDA folks came and visited them afterwards. Did I tell you? I'm not sure I told you this, but came and visited the farm and everything, and they were just so enthusiastic about the whole thing. And they use the Atlantic white cedar for timber and lashings, habitat for plants and animals, cleansing of the water in general, and temperature moderation and defense. They still remember vividly the Great Swamp Massacre, when the British tortured a little tiny kid, Indian boy, to tell him where his village was hiding in the middle of this Atlantic white cedar swamp, and he took him in there, and they killed everybody. So that lives on in the tribal memory. So the Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative focuses on the use of their, much like the place names, the entire use of their habitats. They're all the environments, all, both farming and gathering. They're building their traditional houses, building their traditional canoes, gathering all these different products in in the environment, and then farming as, well, not really as they did, because they're not against technology. They're not against introducing things that they didn't have before. Hunting is very important to them still. Seafood, fishing, clamming, so on is very much I mean, working with these people is so wonderful. They just take me out at all times of year, and, you know, we get to do all this fun stuff that's, you know, it's just really living with their environment, and they love it, and I love it, and, you know, it's just part of their lifeways. The Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative has been incredibly effective with outreach. This year alone, this was a youth summit that they had 50 Native American kids from the eastern region, so it went, but eastern in some sort of, because it went from North Dakota, North and South Dakota, down to Louisiana, and they had kids from Maine down to Florida and everywhere in between. And came, you know, 50 kids. And this woman in particular, she's from Florida, she's from the Seminole tribe, and I swear, I said, that woman's gonna be our first Native American president. She is so impressive. This kid is 16 years old, and she can stand up there and talk about issues. She's one of the people that's suing for about firearms in schools, and you know, she's just really incredibly active, articulate young woman. Then just 3 weeks ago, they had the Intertribal Food Sovereignty, what was the whole title? I wrote this down because I knew I couldn't remember. Intertribal Food Sovereignty Summit. And there were 350 people that came from all over. That was from Fiji to Alaska, you know, and Canada to Florida. So they really stretched far and wide and brought in people from all over the place.
Where was that?
That was in Rhode Island.
What
Yeah, this is all on this farm. This is all.
Isn't that the Mashantucket Pequot Museum?
Yes,
That
yeah,
space
well, they
that-
used that space because that's where they could house 350 people. You know, that's not easy, right? So anyway, and then this is me and two of the Narragansett at the Climate Change COP 22, the meeting of the parties in Morocco. I took them with me to Morocco, and they stood up and explained about the Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative and how important climate change was to their ways and their culture, and what they were trying to introduce as solutions to the problem. And it was inspiring, absolutely inspiring. And then they have funny, you know, then they do all these important, and then they have funny things, like this was the baby regalia contest. You know, where they got all the babies in the tribe to dress up in their traditional dress, and it was hilarious because trying to take a picture of these people, they were like, you know, herding cats. You know, one or another of those kids is escaping from that picture at all moments. So they think very broadly and very creatively, and you know, they think internationally like this, or big picture thinking like that, and then they act incredibly locally. So this is their farm stand that they have, that anybody, you know, their neighbors and so on, they want to come by and see what they're doing and teach them about organic, everything's organic agriculture. And they went to their county fair and they won first prize, you know, and best farm stand garden overall and things like that. It's just, I love it. They're doing wonderful things. So we received, you know, I do a lot of grant writing and kind of, you know, I'd play weird roles. I do whatever was needed, you know, I set off the horns to time things and, you know, weird stuff. But I got funding for the United Nations COP in Marrakesh for them to go. I helped write grants for the greenhouses and the tractors and their well and their solar electrification. We're working on cultural plantings, and I'm hoping that you can come in October and help us with that some. And habitat restoration, youth education I mentioned, intertribal food sovereignty summit, and we're seeking funds now. We're trying to write for a book on Narragansett plant uses, you know, returning their, restoring the knowledge that they've had that's in the literature to the tribe now, and to build on that. And I have a woman that wants to dedicate, a Narragansett woman who wants to dedicate her life to plant uses, and I hope she's applying to Brown for graduate school, and I'm hoping that works. They have these historic buildings from built in 1670 on the property, and we're trying to get them. It's really hard to get money to restore buildings, you know, and things like that. You can get money for projects, but things like restoration is hard. And they've got this incredible old house that they would like to turn into a museum, and they have this amazingly beautiful barn that they want to restore into kind of a meeting place for the tribe and to teach people. So those are my 3 projects here, and it's a little hard to see how they kind of hold together, what the common theme is, but for me, this idea of climate change and environmental change, both studying what is happening, but also trying to use what we call traditional ecological knowledge to address some of these problems. You know, that it isn't only modern solutions that we need to look to, but we need to look to some traditional knowledge, and how that could help us through the problems that we have today. So, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I would be happy to answer any questions. And if I didn't answer your question before, I would like to try again. Yes?
I was just gonna ask, how many people are in that Narragansett tribe?
It's somewhat over 1,000.
Are
It's
they-
not a lot.
Are they in that area or?
Yes, it's not far from they have tribal territory. They have this beautiful, they have really worked hard not to cut down their forest. And so that's one of the reasons they wanted this farm so badly, is because they didn't want to farm in the middle of their territory. They wanted to keep it, you know, in their native forest. And it's a beautiful piece of forest, and it has some beautiful, just pristine lakes on it. They're trying to reestablish some of the fish migration into the ponds and so on there. So they are doing restoration work in the territory as well. But it's a tiny piece. I don't know, it's a few thousand acres. Yes.
The invasive shift, do you recall kind of numbers for the curves there? I was just speculating that perhaps there was less invasives at the time of the
There were,
initial
oh,
study,
definitely,
so
there are
maybe
more
there's some-
invasives now than before. But still, it just seems as though the invasives were not significantly different. You know, and I have a hard time, it may be that there's this open window that invasives can move into, this early window, now that it's so much warmer, so much earlier. These plants that are ready to bloom then have an open window. But it could also, it has occurred to me that it could also be horticultural, in that we all wanna plant things that bloom early in the spring, you know,
That's
we're just.
exactly what I was thinking, that they
Yeah,
were
yeah.
purposefully meant to fill a gap that, when it's
Exactly.
still gray out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I can't distinguish between those two factors, but it could be either one or both of those. Yeah, no, that's occurred to me too. Yeah.
In the study of place names, did you encounter place names that had to do with fire or intentional fire, or also maybe in the either the phonology or any of the other ethnobotanical names?
Place names to do it. Well, that's a tough one. I'd have to go back and really look in the place names. They did use fire. I mean, there's no question about them using fire. And they used it in, both in conjunction with agriculture, but also to, you know, to increase deer browse and to, you know, open up habitat to keep certain habitats open. So there's no question that they used fire. Was there a second part to that question? I'm not sure.
Pardon me?
Was there a second part to that question?
No, that was it basically. I mean, I heard one of the Wamanoa tribal members talk about the return of some specialized groups having to do with them being able to burn certain sections of their land again.
Yeah, we did a study. This is separate and maybe not relevant, but I think it is. When I was a professor in Ohio, I had a student who looked at the occurrence of useful plants, medicinal plants and foods and so on, in burned and unburned habitats that the Forest Service they were looking at for growth of trees and stuff like that. But we went in and looked for just all plants and useful plants in particular, and we found significantly more useful plants in the burned areas. But for political reasons, we could never get that study published.
Wow.
Because people are so, you know, they're so polarized on their views of burning and the, you know, and what it means that every time we get it reviewed, you know, they send it to somebody who, you know, we tried to make it as innocuous as we possibly could and still get the data out there, and still we get knocked down every time, so. Yeah.
Many of the folks here know Dr. William Patterson is a paleoecologist who is also a fire ecologist. So he has looked at the levels of charcoal and throughout Native American periods and increase in charcoal during those periods. He also has over 2 decades of data on phenology within certain parts of New England, and that might be interesting for you to talk with him because he's done fossil pollen work.
And where is he?
He is retired from University of Massachusetts.
But he's still.
And he lives in Northfield, Massachusetts. I can give you his contact
That'd be great. I'd
information.
appreciate that.
The other thing that he mentioned once is that the Native Americans, you know, they used fire to manage low bush blueberry
Yes.
and high bush
Yes.
blueberry.
Definitely.
They also used fire for turpentine stores. And we were at Crane today, and we were looking on Turpentine Road, which is actually an ancient road that's described during the first settlers when they came. Miles Standish first described it. And the Native Americans were actually tapping the pitch pine trees and burning those areas extensively. So it would, the Narragansett actually using any management habitat management tools like prescribed fire on
They
their?
do use prescribed fire, they do use pitch, they do use, you know, the pine trees and so on. They definitely manage for blueberries, and other, you know, the other fruits that are gathered and so on. So, yeah, I'm amazed with, I don't know, my impression is the Wampanoag have retained a little bit less, but the Narragansett really, they really continue a lot of their traditional land management systems, you know, and they value that. And they continue their belief systems and their, you know, their whole world view is just, it's been really enlightening for me to, you know, when I went to Morocco, just as an example, a silly example, but when I went to Morocco with them, I was buying, you know, we were all buying gifts for people back home. And I bought something, I bought this beautiful Moroccan wood inlaid box, you know, that they're famous for. And they said, who are you gonna give that to? And I said, well, actually, I'm keeping that for myself. And they were like, you know, because for them that is just terrible. You know, you do not buy something for yourself, you know. And so that, you know, it's just an example of how our worldviews are just so different. You know, and their story about wampum, you know, you hear on NPR this little 7-year-old boy saying, oh, wampum is like money. Well, it's not. You know, what wampum was when somebody did something really nice for you, you gave them wampum. Just as a, not as money, but as a sign of respect. You know, like I could give Pam wampum because I just respect her that much. You know, but it's not like I'm paying her for, you know, for helping me. And so the people that were respected throughout the village were covered in wampum because people gave them so much. So it's that, you know, I mean, it's just, they have a different worldview than we have. You know, and we came in with our idea of land ownership and we'll pay you for this piece of land. You know, we have this idea of Indian giving. Well, they gave and they took, you know, but it was still theirs, you know. I mean, that's just part of how they saw the world. And there just wasn't a lot of cultural sensitivity back then. And it's still really hard to internalize how they view the world. I wouldn't even begin to, you know, try to portray how they view the world, because it's a different reality. But I would love that address. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jackie has provided us with a beautiful cake decorated by one of our early BCCCI members, Karen Wilson, who now works for the local grocery store, Windfall Market. She's their cake decorator, and she does a beautiful job.
So, Brett, before we do that, I forgot to make an announcement. So, the 300 Committee, which is a local land trust here in town, has asked me to give a talk about edible wild plants, and that talk's going to be April 11th. For those of you that might be interested. And we haven't figured out yet whether I'm going to talk about edible weeds, invasives, edible mushrooms and stuff like that, or talk about edible native species, plants that we want to encourage people to plant in their own yards. So it'll be one of those two topics.
Thanks, Russ.
Yeah.
Did anybody not sign in?